You have a very interesting and robust history on your way to where you are today, Mayor. A lot of folks don't know about that here in Silicon Valley. Would you mind sharing with us how you got here and why you're running for governor?
First of all, I want to thank you for coming on a Thursday morning to this event and for your support for this very, very important issue, the work of the Silicon Valley Community Foundation. I want to thank Kim, wherever you are, for your work, and also Ted, wherever you are. Both of them have elucidated me on this issue over the last year or so, and I just want to thank them for their work. You know, you said it. I grew up here in California, in L.A., in the 1950s and 60s. Grandpa came here 100 years ago from León, Guanajuato, Mexico. Came here with a dream, shirt on his back, worked in the fields, built a small business. By the 20s, was a wealthy entrepreneur. Lost all his money in the Depression, lost his wife as well. Put my mother and my aunt in a foster home, but visited them on the weekend, had them in Catholic school. So I say to people, I'm here on the shoulders of the greatest generation, a generation that gave me much. Mom married an immigrant who was an alcoholic and violent. Grew up in a home of domestic violence and alcoholism, left when I was 5. My mother raised us for most of that time. You know, I tell people the passion I have for education has everything to do with the fact that although we struggled and to make ends meet, she did all she could to put us in a Catholic school. So it was a Catholic school that gave me a foundation. I was kicked out of school, as many know. I went from a college prep Catholic school to a public school that put me in shop classes and basic reading classes. Dropped out, had a great mom and a great teacher, Herman Katz, that helped me along the way. Went to East LA College for a year, UCLA after that on an affirmative action program. And I've always said, some people will say I came in through the back door, but one thing's for sure, I got out the front. And it's why I'm so committed to giving people second chances, to investing in education. I was speaker of this, I was community organizer and a labor leader for 25 years before I got elected in 1994. In 94, I was a majority whip. 2 years later, majority leader. 3 years after my election, speaker for 2.5 years, where I focused a lot on education, healthcare for kids. Author of Healthy Families, 750,000 kids had healthcare because of my efforts. The co-author of the Class Size Initiative to reduce class sizes. Took us from, I think, somewhere in the deep 40s in per pupil education to the low to mid 30s in 2 years in the speakership, and ran for mayor in 2001. Won the primary, lost the runoff. Ran for city council 2 years later, and 2 years after that became mayor of Los Angeles. Was mayor for 8 years. I took on this issue of schools. LA had 1 out of 3 schools were failing, 44% graduation rate, and out of 700 schools, 700 plus schools, only 89 of them were successful at 800 and above when we were measuring schools. We took that 1 out of 3 failing schools to 1 out of 10, the 44% graduation rate to 72%, and the 89 successful schools to 280. And importantly, began to sell the idea that these kids can learn and they can make it, but we've got to set high expectations for them. Finally, you said ran on making LA safest big city. We didn't get there. We were number 2 behind New York for big cities over 1 million. But 44% drop, 45% drop in homicides, a 49% drop in violent crime, a 55% drop in gang crime in the city that was then the gang capital of the United States. Built 3 light rail lines, 1 busway, more than any city in the country. #1 American city to reduce carbon emissions, 28% below Kyoto levels, and #5 in the world, and made LA a clean tech capital of the United States. And finally, took us from the brink of bankruptcy in the middle of the worst recession since the 1930s to a more sustainable footing where, we're no longer in deep deficits. So that's a little bit about who I am and what I've done, and now I'm all yours.
Well, thank you, Mayor. It's certainly a robust and compelling story to get you to where you are today, and running the second largest city in the country, I'm sure has given you the experience to navigate government systems and be on the ground at the same time. Tell us, first of all, why you're running for mayor, and I'm sorry.
I do the same thing. I was mayor for so long. I do the same thing, so please.
I used to work for a mayor too, so
Yeah,
mayor's stuck.
And a good one, by the way.
Thank you. Tell us why you're running for governor, and what are some of the biggest challenges you want to tackle as governor?
Well, first of all, I neglected to say, I also have 6 children, blessed, and I'm proudest of those 6 children than I am the things I've done in my life. But why am I running for governor, not mayor?
Good mayor.
I love this state. I always talk about my grandpa because, and my life because, how far I've come. And I believe that this is a great state, the Golden State, but a state where we have to look inside and ask ourselves the question, why are we the 5th largest economy in the world with the highest effective poverty rate in the United States of America? How can we truly say we're the Golden State when we're leaving so many people behind? My whole life, my biography, my life has been a life of overcoming challenges, and I believe that our state and our leaders need to focus on growing together, on making the human capital investments that redirect a prison pipeline to a pipeline of hope and opportunity. And I believe the way to do that is we need to create an environment where we're growing our economy, focusing on growing middle-class jobs, educating and training our future workforce for those jobs, and making the investments in the infrastructure that we need. And I've got, the experience of doing that. I mean, we can debate and talk, tweet all we want, but at the end of the day, I ran a city that's 5 times larger than any city in this state. It's both the richest city and one of the poorest cities at the same time. It's politically diverse. If you go to the North Valley, you're in Ohio, and no, for sure. I had to go there, and it wasn't easy. And so I'm running because I really do believe that we could do better at restoring the luster of that California dream by growing together.
Thank you for that, Mayor. And a lot of your campaign, you do talk about the divide, the inequality, the poverty in California, and the achievement gap between poor kids and more affluent kids. What are some of the specific policies or changes you would make as governor if you're elected?
Well, when I acknowledged Kim and Ted, look, I focused while I was mayor and while I was speaker a lot on K through 12. It's not in Los Angeles, just like here, it's not within the purview of the mayor's job to address improving our schools. But I said early on, our city won't thrive or survive with a 44% graduation rate. And, you know, it seems to me that an important issue for the next governor is early child education from 0 to 3. We got to restore the cuts, about $1.2 billion, and universal preschool and full-time kindergarten. I look back and in self-criticism, I think I didn't take into account enough that these kids were coming in so far behind. You know, 2 and 3 million words down. You know, my kids were, you know, mom was, you know, playing, you know, classical music when they were in the tummy. And these kids don't have that kind of access. In fact, the joke I used to have, came back from the speakership one day, came back while I was speaker, came back home one day, and my son was listening to classical music, and I didn't grow up listening to classical music. I've since, you know, gone to the opera and the symphony, but, you know, I can't tell you that I'm in any way familiar. And so I said to my son, "Are you listening to Bach?" And he's 5, and he says, "No, I'm listening to Handel, but I could see why you confused them." And, you know, not every kid gets that. And it seems to me that we're going to have to do a better job of really starting a lot earlier for these kids. So those are specific things. Now, I've been very clear. I was a fiscally prudent mayor. We were looking at a budget deficit bordering on a bankruptcy. And I had to be tough, and I had to say no to a lot of people. And that didn't make me very popular. So I'm not making a lot of promises about new programs, but those are 2 that I'm committed to. I don't know that we have the infrastructure to do all the 1.2 million cuts over in the first year, but I can tell you that, and I've already said to some of the groups who are working there, that each year we're going to build on to restore that infrastructure and to expand on it.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, and the cuts, the statewide cuts have taken a little bit of a turn, and in fact, the LAO came out with a report earlier this week that showed that if the economy continues as is, the state will have a budget surplus of about $5 billion a year for the next 6 years.
But
if
no,
that happens, sure.
It's not going to happen. You know what I mean? What we have, this is the longest sustained recovery. It is not going to happen. We're not going to have for 5 years more, you know, this kind of a sustained recovery, which is why I've said, you know, the next governor is going to have to be also prudent about how we do all of this. But I am committed. If I have to cut other things, I will. I haven't figured out what they are. But I think this is a priority, because you heard me say we've got to redirect the prison pipeline to a pipeline of hope and opportunity. And you do that with an education. My life turned around when I went back to school, went to community college, went to UCLA, affirmative action program, and then went to law school. My life turned around with that. We can turn lives around if we make these investments. And somebody needs to address the light. He's getting it right in the eye, and so is she, and it's going like this. If somebody could pull that, right. That thing right there.
Thank you, Mayor. In terms of again looking at the electorate, you talked about a lot of families and how they're struggling. Kim mentioned a poll that the Choose Children campaign commissioned, and we shared with you and the other candidates that 9 out of 10 voters are saying that the next governor should invest more in young children. Where do you think that's coming from, and how do you feel about that type of almost universal agreement of what the next governor should do?
I think it's a stark reminder of a decades long of disinvestment in our kids, and particularly poor kids. You know, I mean, everybody here, all of us, are of means. Not everybody can afford childcare, heard the SEIU survey that said their members were more concerned about childcare and early child education than they were even about their own pay and benefits. So I think that's what it's a reflection of. For me, to be candid though, that's not what's driving it for me. It's it could be 20% support, and I fight for it. I have a history of being willing to take on unpopular issues. When I first got elected in 1994, 187 was on the ballot. I saw the polls. I was against it. 3 strikes you're out was on the ballot. I saw the polls. I was against it. I was president of the ACLU and against the death penalty. It was not lost on me that those weren't popular things. I took them on anyway. And so if it had a 20% support, I'd be for it. Because I think it's what we got to do if we're going to address the fact that the state is leaving so many people behind. For some, unfortunately, those people are invisible. They're not to me. They're human beings who deserve the great generosity of America that I got.
Thank you, Mayor. Now, you did mention...
Antonio's fine, by the way. This is what I tell people. You don't have to call me mayor or speaker. When I'm governor, you will have to say gov.
I won't confuse it with mayor at that time, that's for sure. Thank you, Antonio.
Though I think the governor should be like a mayor. I mean, I think you have to be present in these jobs. When I was mayor, I was ubiquitous in my town. And, I think you got to be present. So I'll be like a governor that's like a mayor. So you can call me mayor.
Thank you, sir.
Antonio.
Antonio, thank you, Antonio. You had mentioned SEIU and some of the teacher pay rights that they've been working for, especially for child care workers and family daycare home providers for a number of years now. I want to share with you a couple quick stats and get your reaction to it. Half of child care workers are they themselves on public assistance. And they're averaging around $8 to $11 an hour in pay in public contracts to care for our youngest children in the state. What would you do as governor to ensure that these early childhood educators are compensated fairly for the immense amount of work they're doing?
Well, again, within the confines of budget constraints, I think we're going to have to look. I've said in San Francisco and even here in this part of Palo Alto, but in the San Jose area, I've said that I'm all for the shared economy. I just think the shared economy has to share. There'll be millions of people out of a job very soon. Some people talk about universal basic income, which would be a form of welfare. I think most people look in the mirror and they define themselves by what they do. And, we've seen that welfare never cares for people in the way that they need to. So I think we're going to have to look at our economy and reevaluate jobs on the service they're providing and value those services to a greater degree. That won't happen overnight, but it does have to happen. Because the people who are caring for our kids, I know I speak for everybody here, you value your kids. So you ought to value the people that are taking care of your kids when you can't. So I think we've got to look at that as a society, because putting all these people out of work is not the answer. So I want to get great thinkers to help us think through that, probably train to a greater degree so that you can make the case for higher wages, but very supportive of the notion that these people are providing a great service. And the same is true for home health care workers, people that work taking care of our parents, our family members. Oftentimes don't barely making minimum wage, saving us money on a nursery home. So we need to think through that and evaluate how we move forward. So I'm open to it, of course, but within the confines of, what I don't want to be is a snake oil salesman and try to sell the idea that you could do all of that with a limited budget. What we don't realize is an example, and I was reading the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial, left at 4:30. By the way, everybody, I was freaking out. I get to the airport, and my plane was canceled. I have 10 minutes. There's an Oakland flight, a San Jose flight, and I'm trying to figure out which one's closer to the people who are picking me up. And I picked San Jose, and I actually got here earlier, but I was freaking out because I said, they're not going to believe that my plane canceled. They're going to think I canceled, right? But, from my vantage point, we do have to acknowledge that there are limits. So I was starting to say, I was reading about the tax plan. This tax plan, the Trump tax plan, is going to put tremendous constraints on the state of California. Not only will you not be able to deduct your state and local taxes, which will put a pressure on, raising taxes anywhere else, but also it's going to undermine the ACA, so affect and cut people from the ACA. It will have far-reaching implications on this state. And the next governor is going to have to grapple with that.
Thank you for that, Antonio. Now, you had mentioned the shared economy and how government's going to have to struggle with a lot of stuff coming down from Washington. Shifting a little bit to what employers can do. In Silicon Valley, a lot of companies here have provided employer-based paid family leave to support their workers. Not many of them are the lowest income of the state, but what are your feelings about employer-provided paid family leave policies?
I'm all for them, and obviously I think it's important that enlightened employers do that. But for a small business person, it's difficult. And so, we're going to have to look at innovative ways to incentivize them, because if you're a mom and pop, or have a handful of employees, a lot more difficult to provide those kind of benefits. I do think, though, in an enlightened society, we ought to do that. Europe does it. And for those of you who travel, I think, they live well too. And actually, they live very well. And I think, we have to make sure that we're all sharing in the prosperity. And it seems to me that making those investments is right, but a little different for a small business than a Yahoo.
I want to shift gears a little bit to an area you covered earlier on, and that's the K-12 education space. Choose Children and this effort really is around talking about what you mentioned, how kids were coming unprepared to kindergarten. What do you feel is the role of K-12 education to ensure that kids are coming in prepared? Is there a role for them to play?
Well,
or does their role start right at kindergarten, and that's when their role starts?
I'm not an expert. I couldn't tell you. I do think that the fact that Prop 98 doesn't include early child education doesn't make any sense to me. I think it should. I think we all have a responsibility to prepare these children, which is why I think the state needs to make an investment. A key would be also part of that investment, educating parents about their role. I mentioned that I took our schools from 44 to 72% graduation rate. I also took on a subset of schools because almost everybody was critical of our effort. So I took on the worst schools. They had a 36% graduation rate. They now have an 81% graduation rate. Mendes High School, named after the famous desegregation, or not desegregation, famous civil rights lawsuit giving Mexican-American kids the right to go with Anglo kids in Orange County in 1946. Mendes High School has a 94% graduation rate. My alma mater overall has an 81%, but the magnet has a 99%. So we have a parent college, and we teach parents rights, roles, and responsibilities. And so I think part of the investment around early education has to be educating parents about what they can do and helping them, understand their responsibility to help to develop their kids as well. So I'd say that the one area is looking at Prop 98 to include all of these kids from 0 to kindergarten. And there may be others, but I'll look to the experts on what other things they could do in that regard.
Thank you, Antonio. I wanted to...
There you go. Be good.
I'm getting the hang of it now. It is.
Antonio.
It's like, yeah. We realize that California has many challenges, and a lot of these challenges, you mentioned a few of them, tax reform, how that impacts families and what that means for the stress of a family and how that translates to their kids. Want to spend some time to talk a little bit more broadly about some of the other challenges outside of education and directly early childhood still impact kids, but some of the other challenges that you want to tackle as governor.
Healthcare. I believe that healthcare is a right, not a privilege. Universal healthcare has to be our goal. There's no question that even if this tax plan didn't pass, and it looks like it's on the road to passing, there will be further attempts to undermine the ACA. That means, anywhere, depending on the proposal, 2 to 5 million people could be impacted, many of them children. It seems to me that that has to be an area that the next governor has to make a priority. The economy, as I said, I'm a Democrat that believes that we've got to focus on the economy again. I recently was told, when I was focused on improving the business climate for small business, someone said to me, "You sound a lot like a guy I know you didn't vote for." And I said, "Who was that?" And they said, "Donald Trump." I almost choked. I said, "Actually, I sound a lot like a guy I did vote for." And he said, "Who was that?" I said, "Bill Clinton." I think that Democrats, and this is a blue state, need to focus on the economy more. We can't be afraid to improve the business climate, particularly for small business, which is the motor force of our economy. We've got to, look at, Byzantine bureaucratic rules that we have, agency fiefdoms that, can streamline while still protecting, those things that we seek to protect through those regulations. And, when I was mayor, it used to be that you had to go to 12 departments to develop in the city of LA. We had already had one of the strictest development kind of initiatives from, I think it was Prop U in the 80s. It was very difficult to build anything. I took us down from 12 departments to 1. They're now at 2, but, I made it easier to develop, to build, and it's why we're having a renaissance downtown. And it seems to me that the next governor is going to have to focus on the economy, improve our business climate for small business, look at things like CEQA that are broken. I said that number one American city in reducing carbon emissions, took us from 3% renewables to 20%. LA signed agreements. LA will be completely off of coal by 2025. And yet, we got a broken CEQA that, I was able to get an exemption to shorten the time to review for a football stadium, and we can't do it for affordable housing, housing for homeless, building infrastructure. It's difficult to build here. And so I'm going to look at all of that. Education, I said, training. You know, I took umbrage, and when people tell me not everybody's going to college, I always shoot back. And I say, do you say that to your kids? Because if you don't say that to your kids, don't say that to mine. And, you know, I push back. But we know that not every, you know, I know that not everybody's going to college, so I want to bring back career technical education. We'll be 1.5 million down in the number of college graduates we need by 2025, and 1 million down in the number of people with specialized skills. So it seems to me we need to focus on both of those things. So those are areas. And then infrastructure. You know, 3 light rail lines, 1 busway, built more schools than any city in the country because we had the most overcrowded school district, put $4.5 billion at the port, at the airport, $1.5 billion at the port. You know, we've got to build again. And, but it won't be just raising the gas tax, because I tell people, and I did support it, but I tell people, look, you know, if you're driving a Tesla, gas tax doesn't mean anything to you. If you're driving a Toyota pickup and you're coming from Stockton to San Francisco, it does mean a lot to you. And we've got to acknowledge that. And, you know, what they probably should have done, they hadn't done it, I think, since '88. They should have done, you know, a penny or 2 pennies, you know, incrementally instead of 12 cents, plus the 30 cents, I believe it is a big number that's going to come with cap and trade. So what I want to do is think of innovative things. The way I was able to put 3 light rail lines and a busway on steroids was I went to the federal government and I said, we're putting up our own money. You're not giving us any money. Give us low-cost loans and bonds. Allow us to have regulatory reform so that CEQA, which you do first, the toughest environmental standards in the country, then NEPA, the federal ones, which is almost unnecessary because once we've gone through ours, they don't need theirs because ours is tougher. We had to do both. Put 2 years on the time it took to build. So I want to think of innovative things, public-private partnerships. We all travel all over the world. The airports you go all over the world, they're not built by the government all the time. They're built by the private sector. Why can't we, in a world where we're not building enough, you know, infrastructure, why can't we do public-private partnerships, you know, regulatory reform, innovative financing? And I think that's what I'll do as governor because that's what I did as mayor.
That's
not
great.
to be confused.
Thank you, Antonio. I just have I have two questions, and then we're going to turn it over to the audience for a few more questions, to the people, right? To ask a few more questions. You mentioned healthcare. First of all, a nod to you as speaker. So the Children's Health Insurance and Universal CHI was started in Santa Clara County. So just a nod to everyone who worked on that in the early 90s, but it was you as speaker who took it statewide. So thank you for taking something local and going statewide.
Yeah. It wasn't something I invented. I authored it, I didn't invent it.
No, for sure. But you mentioned housing, and housing is a big issue in many urban parts of California, but it is also affecting, like you said, the Central Valley, people who are going to job centers but still driving up costs in what used to be lower cost regions of the state. You mentioned CEQA. There's a bond measure that the state is looking at. Local bond measures here have passed for affordable housing. What are some of the other innovative housing, affordable housing efforts you would undertake as governor? And then I got one last question for you.
Along the lines of America Fast Forward, which was my plan for innovative financing that I took to Obama, initially laughed me out. I took it to then Speaker Pelosi. Almost everybody laughed me out of the room. And after 2 years, I got Barbara Boxer and then, you know, Republicans to get behind, and finally the president. And I want to do the same thing with housing. So what do we need to do? One, we need to bring back redevelopment. Redevelopment was a tool. We lost cities and counties lost $1 billion in the middle of the recession for housing and economic development. And is it any coincidence that the housing crisis has just gotten worse during that period. I led that fight. I took on the administration and the legislature. So I wrote in the Chronicle the other day that I want to bring back redevelopment 2.0. There were some excesses, we'll fix them. 2, regulatory reform. We've got to bring back, we've got to have regulatory reform. 3, I want to put a housing trust fund together. I had run on that in 2001. I lost the race. In 2003, they created a housing trust fund in LA. In 2005, it was they never funded it. They had a housing trust fund. I put $100 million. We leveraged $1 billion in tax credits, built 20,000 units of housing in the middle of the recession when very little was getting built. So I want to put a housing trust fund together that, with redevelopment, that will incentivize cities and counties to put up their own money. They have to have a plan for housing the homeless, workforce housing, affordable housing, transit-oriented development. According to McKinsey, we need about 3.5 million new units by 2025. 1.2 million will come from transit-oriented development. That means transit development around transportation stations, routes, the Caltrain, the BART, the subway, all of that stuff. And then finally, they have to have, regulatory reform if they want to access our money. So those are some of the things I want to do. And again, everybody can say what they're going to do. What I encourage people to do is to look at the track record. I actually did it in a tough environment. So those are the things. And I'll be candid with you. It's going to be tough because there's going to be a lot of special interest pushing back. The reason. And the last thing is, a lot of the affluent cities, you see it here, a lot of the affluent cities don't want to work to build housing for the people that have to work in their city because they don't want that kind of housing. Forcing them, they try to do that. It's going to be really difficult to force them. So what I want to do is put up a cap and trade like program that says by region, if you don't put up money for that housing, for the homeless, workforce, affordable, then you're going to have to give to a kitty so that other cities and communities do. It's the only way we're going to deal with this crisis. And again, I know what that's going to engender. A lot of very upset people. But at the end of the day, these aren't jobs where you're looking to be the most popular person. These are jobs where you're looking to make the tough calls. And we're going to have to make a tough call because everybody in this room, even if they're not in the situation of looking for a home and the crisis isn't hitting them, it's hitting their kids. I bought a house at 24 years old. My kids couldn't buy a house at 24 years old without my money. It's just a fact. And I'll help them. I'm helping them. But at the end of the day, this is a crisis, and we have to treat it like a crisis, and that's what leadership's about. It's about making the case and then making the tough calls.
Thank you. Thank you, Antonio. And thank you for veering off a little bit into other issue areas. That today's event is hosted by the Choose Children Initiative, and we wanted to focus on children, but we know
children need housing.
They need housing. They need health care. They need their parents to be financially secure with good jobs. So we certainly understand all that. My last question before we turn it over to the audience is pretty direct, Antonio. You mentioned
we like direct.
Universal preschool. You mentioned early childhood should be part of Prop 98. You mentioned full day kindergarten. Are you willing to commit in your first budget, in your first 100 days, to prioritize any and all of those ideas as governor?
I said yes. I said that earlier on. There are very few things I'm going to commit to. And believe me, I've been on this trail now for a year, and people are trying to get me. As an example, single payer. I distinguish myself from the front runner, mostly because I've had to balance budgets in my time. There's not $400 billion in our budget for single payer. There's just not. And I've said I'm not going to do that. And I lost 2 endorsements because I was willing to be truthful with people that we don't have the budget for that. And we also don't have the federal waivers from the Trump administration to be able to, as an example, turn Medicare into single payer. So those are three things: 0 to 5 education, universal preschool, full day kindergarten, that I am going to prioritize. But I'm not prioritizing a whole much more.
I'm Emmett Carson. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the CEO of Silicon Valley Community Foundation. One, I want to thank the mayor again so very much for your candor and for your commitment to the issues we care so much about, and a commitment that isn't equal to other commitments, but a commitment that says, I will make other hard choices to preserve this commitment. So we appreciate that very much. I also want to thank our partnership with First 5 LA. It is important, and as Avo says, it says something when important organizations who care about early learning come together and say, we can do this together. So thank you very much. I also want to acknowledge the Community Foundation's board chair, Sam Johnson, who's in the back, and it's always important to acknowledge your boss. Look, I want to say, like all nonprofits, the Community Foundation is nonpartisan and non-political. But that doesn't mean that we abdicate the voice to advocate and to lobby on issues that we find to be important. We find early learning to be one of those issues that our board has said we need to advocate and lobby around. And that is why we have undertaken an effort to say we have to put this issue on the table front and center in the upcoming gubernatorial election, for every candidate to say what their plan is and what their commitment will be to children. So I want to thank all of you all for coming out, for caring about this issue, for continuing to talk about this issue. I'd say visit our website at Choose Children, and also tweet, social media, tell others. I believe we have 2 more left after this. So the next 2 weeks, and we will have a straight royal flush with all of the candidates having participated. So thank you so much for coming out. Thank you so much for your support.